Marty, we need a second for Sharon's motion. Okay, Nora seconded. Is there any further discussion?
Can you restate the motion again?
That we would delegate the authority to have the open hearing to the CEO.
Thank you.
Any further?
And I'll reinforce what Keith said. You are the receiver essentially in that role. I'm glad you brought that out. It's really just a person receiving comment. But the more efficiency you build into the process early on, because these regulatory processes can get extended if you start amending things. So there are some state agencies that engage in rulemaking for over a year on an issue because of, or even miss the filing dates because it gets so long. So you want to make sure you keep it efficient because it could get long. Thanks, Keith, for saying that.
All righty. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed nay. Any abstentions? The motion passes. So, Jack, you get to have the authority to hold the hearing. Yippee! All righty. When I told everyone that we had additional items on the agenda, new stuff, I forgot to tell you that we have a new contract requiring board approval. So you also have that at your seat, so you can have time to take a look at that. So Joycelyn Grant, you're here for state ledge?
Yes, and I will hand it over to Joycelyn.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I wanted to give the kind of lay of the land as to where we are in the legislative session now. The legislature came back on January 7th after their winter recess and has been introducing bills slowly. The introduction deadline is on February 22nd, so I assume we'll have a deluge of bills in the last couple of days for sure. So up to this point in time, this seems like a very light item because not many bills have been introduced yet. But I want to give you an update on our sponsored bills. We have our annual housekeeping bill that tackles a number of minor conforming and housekeeping kind of changes. And the Assembly Policy Committee, Retirement Policy Committee will be authoring that bill this year. So we have language into council, but the bill has not yet been introduced. So I will bring that bill number to you after that happens, so in March. We have a second technical kind of bill focused on our membership and participation requirements, and so we are looking for an author for that bill right now, and so I will also update you on that. There was a third proposal that I had given you an update on in November, and it was the annual billing of excess sick leave, and it's something we've been working toward for a couple years now. And some additional items that we want to look into, for example, how it's connecting to the Pension Solution Project and the program actuarial effects of that we want to look into more. So we actually won't be looking for an author this year, but we hope to continue on with that because we do think there are some efficiencies to be found there. Many times excess sick leave is unknown at the end of a career, it gets found, and that's when it's reported to us now. It gets found in an audit, and it has to be paid for. So there's interest and other things that are charged at that point in time that make it difficult for the employers. And the other point is they may not have even offered that excess sick leave. So we're looking at connecting to the employer that did offer that benefit.
Okay. Again, what's the final date for legislation to be introduced?
February 22nd.
So anything that's introduced by then, we should have a write-up at our May meeting.
We should be, or I'm trying for March, but May would be.
Yeah, March, okay.
Yeah, but March would be if there are some very, very late bills that are complex.
But no later than that meeting?
Correct,
okay.
Unless there's gut amends and the bills completely change.
Are you speculating? Are you hearing anything?
I think there will be several bills that get introduced on all different topics, but that would touch on us. So, whether it be on the charter schools front or there would be other pieces on the investment front, divestment bills. So I'm thinking there's going to be kind of a lot that we'll be looking at.
Okay. Thank you.
And some of the ones that have come up that I was unable to include in a matrix because they were later in the process that you will see in March. I just want to make mention of some of the state bills and then some federal bills. But we had, there's AB 181, and it has to do with an emerging manager report. So we are analyzing that currently, and we will bring that to you for a position in March. AB 287 is a simple bill that requires a report that we produce once our audits are completed on our website. So right now it's just the provisions are about mailing, so they're a little archaic. So we're not sure if that's the end point of that bill, but we definitely want to take a look into it. So we'll be communicating with the author's office.
Are you thinking that's a spot bill?
I'm thinking it may be.
Okay.
So we'll see if we can find out some more information about that. On the federal side, HR 141 is the repeal of the windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset. So you'll see that in March as well. So that bill is back for this session, congressional session. And then HR 624, which is known as the Promoting Transparent Standards for Corporate Insiders Act, and it's by Congresswoman Waters, and it has to do with having the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, conduct a study to look into tightening up requirements around insider trading. And actually, the chair and the vice chair use their delegated authority to adopt a support position on that bill, but we'll be bringing back an analysis for you in March so that you can have more of the details around that. And so on that.
Joyce, I just wanted to underscore for our new board members, your comment, because it went fast there around charter schools, because there could clearly be a body of bills dealing with educational policy, which normally wouldn't be our expertise or participation. But given that there is interest in dealing with the membership issue in CalSTRS with charter schools, that would financially impact the organization. So most definitely, that is in your court to consider. So we need to gear up for that discussion that we may well have on that piece of legislation if there's a membership bill.
So Jack, between now and our March meeting, you're going to be doing board orientations
Yes.
with new trustees. Can you make sure that that issue gets vetted, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
That way, when that bill comes, everybody will be up to speed. Okay.
Yeah, and that will be subject to intense perspectives at the Capitol, that bill.
And just to follow up on Jack's comments, we are not only tracking, but trying to stay at the table in discussions about charter school legislation that would touch CalSTRS in a significant way.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, and with that, I was going to move on to the one bill that we do have in front of you today for a position, and it's AB 33 by Assemblymember Bonta, and it is a divestment bill regarding private prison companies, and it's requiring CalSTRS and CalPERS to divest of companies that generate the majority of their revenue from operating, managing, or contracting as a prison or detention center. And so the recommendation from staff at this point in time is to take no position on the bill, given the fact that the board took action to divest of Geo Group and Core Civic in November.
Are there any questions on the bill? Paul?
It's not on the bill, it's on the recommendation.
Sure.
It seems to me the question of whether to divest is a different question from whether this board finds it acceptable for the legislature to tell us what to do with respect to investments. And so I don't see that the fact that this board has voted to divest affects how we would approach any bill that came to us that we saw that would tell us what to invest in or what not to invest in. We have that fiduciary responsibility, not the legislature. So I'm confused about the recommendation. It would seem to me that we would oppose any bill that suggests that we should invest or not invest in anything. That's been our policy, and to change that policy in this case, it seems to me, really is opening up the legislature to being able to tell us what to do. And we should stand on the principle that that's not their role.
Understood. Looking back at SB 185, which was divestment from thermal coal, we had also actually begun the process to move forward with that divestment, and I don't think the decision had been made yet. The board took the same position, no position on that bill as well, given that they were moving in that direction. So just some of the history, and I think there have been different positions on different divestment bills over the years. But I totally understand where you're coming from, and that is another perspective.
Entirely the pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just feel there's too much going on here for us to not take a stand on this. I mean, we have a process by which we decide whether to divest, and that's fine. And we went through that process on private prisons. But that's our decision. It's not the legislature's decision. And so I really see those as two different decisions. And so
Yeah, clearly.
I will not support this.
I mean, it's
this
clearly your
proposal.
purview. It is, I think, Joyce, let's just point out the records, it's an uneven piece here.
Right.
And we can't, we've never said absolutely anything the legislature tells us we say no to. But the record isn't that consistent, so.
I
That's all.
understand that, but I fear we're gonna see more of these. And so
Sure.
I think we should have some consistency.
Yeah.
And
All right.
that's the consistency I would like this board to have, so.
Harry?
I fully support what Mr. Rosensteel just stated. And I understand there's a lot of nuances. And I would, I'm open to being convinced that taking no position is the appropriate action. I'm open to hearing that. But given the record, what's in front of me now, I'm leaning towards opposing it on the principle, as stated by Paul, that we are the elected trustees who have a responsibility, a duty of loyalty, and a duty of loyalty to the fund. And that by allowing another entity to make that decision for us is an abdication of our responsibility, which is completely separate from what the author's intent is. I personally might actually think it's a good idea, but I don't want to abdicate my responsibility and the authority that I have to another entity to tell me what to do. As a teacher, I often was frustrated when we were told what we should do inside our classroom. That kind of professionally objected to that. And I equated that to like, do I go in and tell the dentist how to do his or her dentistry? Do I go into a courtroom and tell the lawyer how he or she should argue a case? But I often felt that as a teacher, others would tell them. So here is another principle where I'm open. Like I said, if I could hear others tell me why we should stay kind of no position, I can be convinced of it, but I'm not convinced yet. And I'd like to hear from others. Otherwise, I'd like to I'll make an amendment.
If I might, Fiona, Lynn, Nora, for the benefit of the new board members, I would like, before you guys speak, to have staff tell you the positions that we can take, or what our procedures are. What our options are, yes, please. So,
Yes, they are. I mean, so
we have set
there are
definitions
various-
for our things,
yes.
so let's do through that, and we'll let Chris talk somewhere in there too. Go ahead.
Sure. There's a range in each position, but overarching, it's support, neutral, opposition. But with support, we have had support if amended, support recommend amendments. On neutral, we've recommended amendments. Oppose, you can say unless amended. So you would oppose it. You would move toward something less than oppose if it was amended, and then just a straight oppose. So there's a range.
And it's important to note too that whatever the position the board takes when we send a message across the street or across the river, we justify or talk about what the position the board had. So we explain what the meaning of whatever position it is you took.
All right. Fiona, Lynn, Nora, can I let Chris jump in before you guys speak, or do you want to hear from Chris first? Okay, Chris?
Thanks. Chris Elman, Chief Investment Officer for the fund. This bill gave the investment office difficulty for a couple of reasons. One, the definition, it's always about the definitions, and it's not really clear. You defined it as specifically companies where the revenue is, and we talked about two specific companies. The bill's more general, so it's not clear. And the old issue of U.S. versus non-U.S., we already raised that with you. The non-U.S. side is much more complex. The other challenge for us is to ask us to engage these companies. We don't own them. I'm not sure why they'd take our time, but also you're spending trust resources to engage what's probably more a social issue than an investment issue with a company you don't have any exposure to, which is to us at least, problematic. So.
Fiona?
Okay.
Go ahead and take your time.
Yeah, so I'm glad you responded. I thought, I was in the legislature for 6 years, and so, you know, we have voted on certain divestment bills, going through committee hearings and hearing the pros and the cons, et cetera. Hearing that we don't own any of the stock, is this bill specifically for CalSTRS to divest when we don't own stock? I don't understand.
Is for CalSTRS and CalPERS to divest, and so I think they were requesting if we had not divested, that we go through that engagement process with the companies that meet the definition, and then look to liquidating those funds. But since we've already essentially complied with the bill, there's nothing left for us to do. CalPERS hasn't taken the same action that I'm aware of.
And did we ever own any stocks?
Yes.
And I just want to clarify, because the definition's so broad, I can't say for sure that we don't own stocks that might come under this definition. The board defined it specifically as the private prison industry, which was 2 companies, CoreCivic and Geo Group, and we sold those already before year end. This definition is broad enough that it could include others. But for the treasurer's sake, because we believe in passive investment, we own the entire U.S. stock market from large to small, so that's why we were exposed. Our active managers never owned these companies. They were always just part of the index. But the board's already taken a divestment position, and we've already disposed of those shares.
Joycelyn, did General Dynamics come under the definition? Did you look at that, just so I know, since that's a topic of yesterday?
With the analyses that we received, that they did not.
Okay.
And I'll just to clarify that, General Dynamics came up on a couple of websites as part of the Divest Private Prisons. They provide tracking software to the federal government. The federal government uses it in the Department of Homeland Security. We were never able to verify that because the government doesn't tell us who their subcontractors are very much, and we couldn't get much of a discussion out of that. There also was a question about United Rentals. But again, those are based on pictures or hearsay. We couldn't prove those companies were linked to the immigration issue. We really just focused in on the 2 private prison companies.
So, since this is my first meeting, what is the discussion process when a bill comes up to divest? Do we look at the issues here, have the experts come, have opponents and supporters come and testify similar to the legislature, or what has the process been?
So we provide the analysis, make the presentation, answer the questions, and if there are stakeholders in the room or others who want to offer public comment, then you hear from them, and then the chair seeks the pleasure of the board and move from there.
It's not a perfect sequence. Some issues the legislature is dwelling on are issues the board is dwelling on. So the one that mentioned earlier by Joycelyn on coal, I'm clear the board's had a lot of conversations around fossil fuels and the controversial issues around coal. So that was a very good example where the board, and through Chris's staff's analysis, was already deeply analyzing the risk in the portfolio and trying to counsel the board on the pros and cons of divesting. At the same time, there was a political process working concurrently with that, and those came together in a fashion. This had the same origins. The board's been hearing from stakeholders for some time around for-profit prisons. Chris's staff did a very lengthy analysis and site visits to for-profit prisons to provide a very strong legal record that we had reviewed these types of securities. The board had a very healthy debate on the issue and had a very close vote around the issue, actually, to divest. But that same conversation was going again concurrently at the Capitol, and that resulted in this bill, partly because our sister system actually was in a different place. You know, I think this was frankly less about us and probably more about our sister system, I would guess. But Chris, did you?
I just would add the context that when you make an investment decision, it absolutely has to be grounded as a divestment decision, It has to be grounded as an investment decision. So you're looking at issues purely from a financial standpoint, where obviously the legislature is looking obviously more broadly at reputational other types of issues. And so that's why frequently the board might take a position and look at an issue where the legislature might look at it completely differently. Simply because of those, you have a different trust mandate than they do. But I understand, I'm not,
Yeah.
as somebody said, policy.
And Fiona, I would think, I mean, this is how bills come to us. If any board member wanted to have more information, we would not necessarily have to vote on the position today. They could ask for it as long as the board is willing to move in that direction, we would move in that direction. So if you felt that we needed to have more research before we took a decision, you could ask for that. If the board agrees with it, we would direct staff to do that. We'd have it done and then come back for a position.
There are some key elements of any divestment bill that we always watch for, even if we're opposed to them. We always would say to make sure that the bill has a clause in it that honors the fiduciary decision-making of the board, that basically allows the board to say, even if the legislation said, we want you to divest from product A, we want a paragraph in that bill that basically says, but unless the board has done that investment analysis and feels that it's fiduciarily unsound decision, that you have an out on that bill. So there's if you will, an escape valve on most of these bills. And I think we recognize the bar is high. We have to honor that political process, but it is there for us to set an investment record that allows you to make a contrary decision to the legislation. So that's essential on any bill that we look for over at the Capitol, even if it's distasteful as a topic.
I just, not keep jumping in behind Jack, simply because you're held responsible for the trust fund. The legislature generally never takes fiscal responsibility for the outcome of the divestment. You have to accept it and bear it.
So Lynn, Nora's requested to speak after Fiona does.
Yeah.
Are you okay if once Fiona's done, I jump to Nora?
That's fine.
Okay, go ahead, Fiona.
Yeah, so it's interesting because, when you sit in the Capitol, we're making policy decisions, right? And now that I'm sitting in this chair, we have a fiduciary responsibility to the 949,000 retirees that we are representing. I'm just wondering, do we ever survey them to say, hey, maybe some of them feel strongly, some of them don't? I mean, because it's kind of their money. We are representing them. They are our constituent base. And I'm just wondering in these type of policy decisions, if we've surveyed our members to see what their appetite is. Are they just strictly focused on, return on investments, or are they, pro these subjects, or do they, they would like us to divest from certain ones? I don't have a sense of it because I just got here, so.
Yeah, I don't know that we have any structured data like that. We certainly get oodles of feedback. There's a lot of avenues for providing us feedback through commentary, and when Chris and I and others here often go out and do speeches, and it's always part of the audience reaction. I mean, the answer I think would be fairly clear is that part of the membership is total returns based and doesn't feel this conversation has a place in that discussion. And then remember, what's so unusual about this membership base versus any other type of retirement scheme, every single one of our members has a college education, if not an advanced degree, and they read, they understand issues, and they're focused on public opinion issues. So I have always found this is a far livelier membership than you would have in any type of retirement system. So they do have concerns about these issues. That phrase you used does come out of some members' perspective, which is, it's my money, I don't want to see my money involved in X, Y, Z. But to use I guess I'd have some concern of using a survey as a democratic tool for having a board make decisions, because their decision scheme is much more narrower to the Constitution, and the fiduciary powers that are defined in the Constitution. So there is a bit of a mismatch there. I think the board should take input, and that's why we have open mics, if you will, because the board gets a lot of input. But in the end, you're going to have to distill that into your legal fiduciary framework and probably tighten up the data, I guess was the way I would see it, so that you still get back into a fiduciary framework. But I've never worked in a system as open as this in terms of the flow of information and getting that type of feedback and stakeholder input.
And one last question. So on the Board of Equalization, I headed the legislative committee, so we would hear every bill that had some nexus to the board. We would try to take a vote to see if there was a will for the board as a whole to weigh in, either support or oppose, or if we couldn't come to a consensus, basically, on our board, individual members could take a position on the legislation. And I don't know what the policy here is on that type of.
We've never gone down that route. I have to,
Oh,
you
okay.
caught me, but you caught me by surprise by that. I didn't realize the BOE had that approach. But no, the positions we advocate at the Capitol are the body of the board.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that in the past, in fact, from your office, prior state treasurers have taken positions on bills, but in the title of their office.
Right, okay.
Certainly not going over and say, I have a different view than the CalSTRS board, and here's my view as a CalSTRS board member. But most definitely, especially around corporate governance issues, the treasurer's office has had a very active record.
Okay.
And right before the board meeting, Danielle did send us the updated list of people that have contacted us on issues.
Okay.
And so you can go back through that and see the type of issues that our members and others have contacted us on. So it'll tell you if it's a member or not.
Okay.
And so that is some of the way you see how our members weigh in. Also, the constituency groups, if they're taking positions, they'll often say something about it, or it'll be in the write-up.
Okay.
Alrighty.
You guys didn't come in your way.
I have 4 people on here now, and Nora, I'm gonna try to jump in. So, it worked, good.
Good job, Dana.
Okay, go
So
ahead.
I need clarification. When we took the position on coal, what was our position on coal?
So to start with, it was no position, but recommend amendments. So there was some tweaks
Okay.
we wanted to see to the language, and then those tweaks were incorporated. And then we just took a straight no position as is listed here.
And then right now, the recommendation from staff is no position.
Correct.
Right. So I agree with both Paul and Harry around the infringement about our investment authority, but I also think it's very early in the legislative process. I mean, bills are not going to be finally introduced until February 22nd. So in the legislative world, there's still a lot of stuff that can happen between now and then. I think the treasurer brought up some really great questions about, are they really understanding some of these intricacies about some of the things that we actually cannot do in our purview because of what they're putting in that bill? And so, one of the things that we have been very proud of and the work that we do is that we engage, right? So why not engage with the legislature between now and March and not, take on your recommendation without actually taking a vote on this, but just move forward, have those conversations, be very clear about this, continue to get additional information. I think these are the kinds of bills that can, they come in with everything at the beginning, and then there's a lot of ways to have a different conversation as it moves on. It depends on where it goes. So that would be it. And then, listening to stakeholders as well as to where they're at with this position, I think would be an interesting point. I don't remember specifically, the details around that, but, and then the other one is, once we have all that, once we engage, I think are we not going to engage, or are we just saying we're going to send a letter that we're going to have no position on the bill? Because I think those are 2 very different things. And you don't have to answer that question now. I think my preference would be that we actually engage with the legislature now and that we hold off on any positions as
We've spoken to the author's office. I mean, they were in communication with us early, so they know what our policy is and how we interact with companies and where we generally stand on divestment issues. And so we've spoken to them. I don't know that the author is interested in narrowing the bill or the fiduciary language that was mentioned earlier is in the bill, but I don't know that there'll be many changes to it. So, we can definitely go back and talk to them again, but I think they have an understanding of where we're coming from. This is the former chair of the retirement committee as well. And then as for other organizations, I have heard there are, on the labor side, there will be several groups that will be coming on in support of the bill.
And just to,
I think my assembly member is very engaged in this bill, and I would like to have a conversation with her about it. I think it's for her to understand what this means. I don't want to put all the pressure on her, but I think there's something there, and I think taking a position right now would be premature.
And we could certainly keep speaking with the author's office to get more information for clarity, but in terms of engaging, I think we need more direction, and, you know, if there was something specific that the board would want us, you know, a direction that you would like us to engage on. But, you know, we could easily keep talking with them and then bring back further information when it's further along in the process in March.
We do have 3 other speakers, and then we have a person at the mic, and we're running behind, so if I could let these people speak, we'll let Ed speak, and there's a couple of points I want to make sure we cover before we take any type of vote. So Lynn? Nora, you were good, right? Okay, Lynn?
Thank you. Controller's Office also backs what Paul and Harry, in their comments that they made. We think that the divestment policy process that the investment staff went through surrounding this last summer and fall was the first time that we'd used the new divestment policy process, and it was a very thorough job, a very good job, and really appreciate that. And we don't want to have another body supersede our authority. And I have a question for you, Joycelyn. So you mentioned that you're expecting additional divestment bills coming up this session. So taking no position now or not giving you the ability to go and start this process, does that impact what you see coming up?
I think this is unique because the board took the position to divest from Geo Group and CoreCivic. And so I think that this bill and the way it interacts with that decision is pretty specific. So I think if future bills come up and if those actions haven't been taken, I think that that's a different story.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Harry?
It's been said, yeah, I think we need to send a message that, you know, as a body, we don't want to abdicate our responsibility. Not that we don't personally perhaps agree and support some of these policy initiatives that good people are trying to accomplish. But we have a thorough process, we have a duty of loyalty, and I have a duty of loyalty to this trust fund. We have fiduciary counsel, we have to do an analysis of the impact of a decision. And I think it would be irresponsible for us not to say that as a body, we don't want to, you know, abdicate our responsibilities and allow another agency or group or individual it will send the message that let's just start passing these bills and putting pressures on the pension funds to do so. The fact of the matter is, and I voted in favor of the divestment bill on private prisons. And at the same time, I know that the history of divestment for us, it's the last tool in our toolbox. We believe in engagement first and foremost. That's what we talk about. At the same time, I know that we've got an unfunded liability, and divestment has actually cost the fund a lot of money over time. So I have to look at myself in the mirror and say, well, at the same time, Harry, you did vote for that. But that's not what's here. I voted on that because of the analysis that was done and the process that we went through. It wasn't someone else telling us that's what we needed to do. So I'm going to make a motion that we oppose the legislation. So a motion on the floor, and I'd look for a second for discussion purposes.
So it's been moved by Harry, seconded by Paul, just a straight oppose, correct?
Correct.
Alrighty, and
that that it's not on the merits of the issue, but on the principle of the legislature directing us and us, that the responsibility is a decision that we would make. And I think this is a good place where we can say we've done this already, and we let us go through our process.
okay, thank you.
So it's on that. It's not on the merits of what the author's trying to accomplish.
Thank you.
Sure.
Keith?
Yeah, I, for one, would need some more information. Some of the background that Chris provided and some of the history that you have gone through in terms of the consideration of the divestment and all that is something I would like a little bit more information about. But what, on this particular bill, Jack, did you say that the language about fiduciary duty is already in there. So I mean, essentially, it's consistent with the constitutional provision.
Correct.
It's the same paragraph that we've been using, Joycelyn.
It is.
And it is the constitutional language.
It's the language that's been included in the last several divestment bills that fits the bill for the fiduciary duty of the board.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
It's the language that's been in the last several bills that fits the bill for the fiduciary duty of the board to make the final decision. There's a couple different ways that it's been phrased in the past, and there's an ideal way, and this bill includes that language.
Brian, do you want to expand on that any?
The specific question that you're asking, Keith, is we've adapted the language over the last decade that I've been here, and this is the language that we've put in there. It really is consistent with the California Constitution, but it's not an exact quote of subsection G.
Okay, but
it does reflect that language.
there's another constitutional provision, Article 3, Section 3.5, talks about the authority of a state agency to refuse to enforce a state law or refuse to comply with the state law unless a court has otherwise found it, on the grounds of unconstitutionality, unless a court, I mean, it says appellate court, but
Yeah, it says appellate court.
as I recall,
Yeah, this is a specific provision that really says that the legislature can prohibit it, provided that the prohibition satisfies the standard of fiduciary care required of a retirement board.
yeah.
So we have specific language in there that basically says, as long as it's consistent with the fiduciary responsibility of the board.
So the bill includes that language?
It does include
It
that
does.
language, yes.
That's our must on every one of these.
That's our must on all of these bills. That's our at minimum negotiation position.
Okay.
And just as context, even though that is our position and all these bills have it, there's never been a case where, that I can think of, where a bill has had that and then we have not, we've exercised that authority or looked at it a different way. So we generally comply with every one of the divestment bills.
Right, but I assume it's because the Constitution says that this legislature can require divestment, but it has to be consistent with, as you put in here, the,
And ultimately, we do go through
when
that
it is in the
process.
public interest to do so, and provided the prohibition satisfies the standards of fiduciary care and loyalty required of a retirement board. So, I mean, basically what you're saying is we have the plenary authority over investments. The Constitution does say that the legislature, so that it's a constitutional provision that says the legislature may prohibit certain investments as long as, when it's in the public interest to do so, and when it's, but this is the more important, when it satisfies fiduciary obligations. So I'm assuming that our compliance, if at all, with any divestment legislation would be only if it's fiduciarily appropriate.
Correct.
Which then means, as long, the reason I asked the question about Article 3, Section 3.5 was, if it didn't have that language, how did, if there's any authority about how that Article 3, Section 3.5 affects our decisions. But if it does have that language, it does seem to me, at least on first blush, and that's why I need further information, is that the legislature is doing something that the Constitution actually says, because it's still leaving up to the board the authority to make the decision based on the fiduciary responsibility. And that's no more authority than what the Constitution already provides us. We can't claim, since we are bound by fiduciary duty, even without this language, that it would be that we're going to do something that is not fiduciarily appropriate. And so in one sense, and this is why being so new is a little bit of a hang-up.
Well, it's also helpful.
Yeah.
You're not new, but,
Well, it becomes, I can understand the desire to say, you don't have a right to tell us that. I mean, because we have plenary authority, that's what the Constitution provides. But if it's already telling us, do it if it's okay, if you find it's okay, is that a layperson thing?
Right.
If you find it's okay and it's appropriate, we want you to do it.
We want you to do
It becomes a political issue then. They're taking a political stance saying, we don't think it's socially appropriate or politically appropriate, or this is where California ought to be. But we recognize, or they may not like it, they're putting pressure on us to say, yeah, Dad, so you better find it fiduciarily appropriate. But our fiduciary decision stands on its own. So what a strong opposition or whatever, I'm not yet familiar enough with the terms of positions, would be saying is taking more of this is a perspective. It could be more of a political decision as opposed to a fiduciary decision. It is more of saying, you can't tell us, but it's already there. They can't tell us. And the legislation that we can interpret is they're telling us no more than what we already do. So that's why some of it is becoming familiar with the legislative positions that this board takes and understanding the distinctions, but also what have we done in the past? Are we being consistent? So otherwise, I'm really setting out a perspective, but also just saying that, I don't feel that at least I'm ready yet from a fiduciary standpoint. I am ready from a political standpoint, but a fiduciary standpoint to be able to make a decision about oppose, whatever. So at this point, if we move to act on this motion, then I'm just going to abstain, and from a fiduciary standpoint.
So, Brian, I guess for me, for our authority, plenary authority under 162 is we have the ultimate decision to decide what we divest and invest in. Do you want to talk about it any further than that?
Well, ultimately, we've the plenary authority, I've talked about whether or not you ever want to spin that chamber given the success in the courts in California on testing plenary authority. But the other point I would make is in reality, when you don't, if you just rely on that would require you every time this comes up to go through the process of having a finding. So you would have to engage your experts. You would have to go through the process of saying, okay, we're receiving all these bills coming out. We now have to go through the process and say, okay, this is what our fiduciary is. This is inconsistent with our fiduciary duty. We're going to have, Chris's folks are going to have to do a financial analysis. We're going to have to get fiduciary counsel. So one of the reasons that you've engaged in this process is try to stop the flow so that it does allow you to operate without having to go through this continuous process of analysis. And so there is, although I absolutely agree with the legal analysis that Keith has articulated, over the years what has happened is you've seen a plethora of these pieces of legislation, and you would be spending a significant amount of time in your investment committee trying to fiduciarily justify not following them. And so the process I think would take a significant amount of time, which I think goes to Mr. Rosensteel and Mr. Keeley's point. So it's just another point of view. I think it's a great discussion. It's great to have other points of view on the board. But I think as you look at some of these, one of the things that we've always taken a look at is whether or not the legislation requires you to make findings, as opposed to sort of the assumption that you just have the constitutional authority, and whether or not you just want to act on that constitutional authority to sort of ignore a piece of legislation without actually doing something about it. And that's that spinning the chamber piece.
Okay. Harvey, you wanted to chime in? Come on forward. While you're doing that, Ed, I usually come to public speakers after everybody's, I have 4 more people in line. Are you okay standing there? I mean, you can sit down, and I promise I will come to you.
I can be sitting down.
Okay.
I'm enjoying it.
Okay, Irene, I'll get you on the list too, and I promise I will come to both of you if you want to sit down. Seriously. Nora, Joy, Paul, and Fiona, are y'all okay with having Harvey speak before you speak? Okay. Harvey, it's to you.
Okay, thank you. Quickly, Harvey Lederman, Reed Smith, Fiduciary Counsel. This is one of those things where the phrase "God is in the details" it rings true, because the legislature has not been consistent with the phraseology of these divestment bills over time. Sometimes they say, we want you to divest, we want you to obey, provided it's consistent with your fiduciary responsibilities. This bill says you don't have to do anything unless you find it's consistent with your fiduciary duties. So if this bill were to pass, then you don't have to do anything. It's not an automatic implementation of any divestment. Put aside that we've already divested previously. The command here in this bill is divest, but only if you first make findings that this is consistent with your fiduciary duty. If it never gets agendized to make findings, you don't have to do it. That's why the legislature's been a little schizophrenic about which way it puts that escape clause in, and that triggers the conversation that Mr. Yamamaka has teed up in terms of consistent with our fiduciary duties. You know that as your fiduciary counsel, I am a zealous defender of your plenary authority and independence to make these decisions and to make them on an investment basis as opposed to a public policy basis. On this particular bill, I have less heartburn along the spectrum of the details because it doesn't command you to do anything unless you affirmatively make findings and trigger a process to do that. And Brian's right, in the past, because of other language, we've had to trigger that whole fiduciary process and looking at the investments and the impact, and is it de minimis, and there's tracking error and that sort of thing. So here, the way it's written gives me a little less pause, a little less concern, except for Mr. Keeley's point is the slippery slope point, which is it's time to stop, it's time to send a message to the legislature that we have to be trusted to make our own decisions as trustees of this pension fund, as opposed to having them laid on our doorstep as legislative policy matters that impact our investment portfolio, rather than we take the initiative. So here, coming back to the issue of whether we oppose or stay neutral at this point, Ms. Vargas has a real point. We're very early in the process. Maybe the board doesn't have to take a position at this stage, and we can wait a little bit longer and see if that language stays in. If the current language stays in, it's not imposing anything on the board unless you want it to impose on you. I hope that's helpful. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. Joy?
Thank you. So I just, I'm actually have a question that takes us back to process a little bit, but I just want to say that I've appreciated the comments and the questions from the treasurer and from Keith. It's been good for, I think, for all of us to have the dialogue and sort of reinforce some of the things that we've discussed over the past several years. But just going back to process, one of the comments I think that Harry made when he made his motion was also providing some context that for the reason for the position that we're taking, that it's sort of from a, in order to have a consistent position about our view on, whether the legislature should direct us to take certain actions with regard to our portfolio as opposed to being specific to the private prison issue. And I think I just wanted to confirm that if the board were to take the opposed position, that we'd convey that sentiment in our formal communication as well as to the author's office or to stakeholders.
Yes, we can definitely communicate that.
Paul?
So I do I'll echo what Joy said, hearing from the treasurer and from Keith has been very helpful, and also hearing from Brian and from Harvey, I think, has been very useful as well. And I guess with respect to sort of this escape clause, it seems to me that we've always had the idea that we wanted to stop things before we had to rely on the escape clause. Because the escape clause kind of raises the issue of considering the issue from both a political and dichotomizing that, making a distinction between the fact that we're reviewing this as a political issue and then separately as a financial fiduciary issue. And I don't think we're here to make political decisions. And so I think what we want to do is we want to say to the legislature, you can say whatever you want. You can even suggest that you think that, the pension funds should consider these things, but don't direct us to do it. Don't tell us that we need to consider this. Don't make us make that distinction between politics and fiduciary investment responsibility. We have tried for a long time to be very engaged on ESG matters, but making sure that they are based on our fiduciary responsibilities and our investment obligations. And that's why I think that I appreciate all of the nuance on the law, but it only fortifies my belief that we should say absolutely no. Don't tell us what to do here.
Yeah, so again, I was over in the other side and, they don't like to be told what to do. Nobody likes to be told what to do. I mean, that's just, I've had bills against, urging doctors to do more CPE on hepatitis B, and they didn't like being told what to do. But I do think that, Mr. Bonta is a smart author in that he hasn't really put a bill in that would force us to do something. And it has the escape clause in it. And he is a lawyer and he understands that this is a 9-month process. Ultimately, it goes to the governor's desk to get signed. I assume we have legislative liaisons or Jack perhaps, where the governor, when it and if it gets to his desk, will come and say, do you have heartburn over this? Can you do it? Is it gonna put, this board in jeopardy of any potential liability, lawsuits, cost? And if you go, well, then he'll probably sign the bill, right? But if you're like, no, this is, the issues, then he's probably gonna not sign the bill. That's kind of the reality of the situation. So the legislature is in charge of policy and they have some budgetary responsibility because they only have so much discretionary funds. But it is a policy, essentially a policy board. I am comfortable as long as we have that escape clause where it doesn't tell us what to do or put us in a position where we are going to be, in legal ramifications. So for me, I'm more comfortable saying no opinion. Let the legislature fight it out over there, goes the governor if he sees fit. Then we can do our due diligence on this side and spend the time and the money. I don't think we should be spending the time and money on every proposal to divest because not everyone is going to get to the governor's desk. But if it's a policy decision for this board to divest and we want to spend the time and the money and the due diligence, I think that is appropriate because that's what this body does, right? We have our own job. The legislature has its own job. I also believe that if the legislation does not have this escape clause, we should be a strong oppose unless amended. That they should not handcuff us, that they should allow us to do their job, but ultimately they are policymakers. They represent their constituents. We have our job financially, fiscally, to do our job as well. So that's where I'm at. I'm okay with no position unless there is not that escape clause. Then we should take a no unless amended, and then the legislature hopefully will work with us to get the clause that satisfies us so that we're not in, a particular, bind.
Nora?
No, I was just gonna say thank you, Harvey, for that information, and thank you as well for Keith for sharing that other perspective. I always try to think about policy and what people recommend long-term, not just short-term. And this is a fantastic board that works really well together and has done the right thing for teachers and for our communities. But God forbid we get a board that doesn't have that vision and that incentive to do the right thing in terms of what I believe the values are that our state has. And so I always feel like there has to be a space for the state legislature to also be able to direct from a larger perspective what policy we want as a state, because it does have an impact locally, I mean, to the work that we do every day. So I would oppose the actual motion. I would prefer a motion that says that we take a no position.
Alrighty, Ed.
Ed Folia from CTA NEA, retired, and I sometimes giving you a little bit of history really gives you a little bit of idea of what's happening today. I represented CTA at the State Council of Education since the 60s, okay? And I can tell you that we've gone through a lot of different issues and so on. But the thing that in the 80s, you know, divestment, especially when it came to South Africa, seemed like a great idea, and it seemed to have worked. But the circumstances were a little bit different. Still, as a member of the State Council and a member of the Retirement Committee, our job is to work and get the feeling of what our members want, but also looking at the fiduciary responsibility that we have as stakeholders, that to make sure that our fund here is not compromised. And so we're constantly having, at our retirement meetings, a dialogue with CalSTRS, and to make sure that we are on the same page. This particular item really was a heavy discussion item on our State Council floor. But we try to make the point, and I am a flaming liberal, and making the point that it is in our best interest to serve our members by protecting the fiduciary responsibility of the fund. And over the time, our CTA, that's where we're coming from. So we do get membership input. It comes from a little different source, but I think other organizations do about the same thing.
Thank you, Ed. I think I've been in some of those meetings where there's been some of that flaming debate that you were actually chairing. Irene?
Thank you very much. Irene Wetzel, presiding officer of CalRTA, California Retired Teachers Association. And regarding bills and legislation, we have a government relations committee that seeks out from their members a platform. And the platform items are having to do with protecting CalSTRS, obviously. That's our mission, is to be a healthy retirement security for our members, but also health care benefits, which are a huge issue. You can imagine someday you'll get there too. And then the last item that we want to protect is the federal issues of Medicare and Social Security. So our committee maybe reviews, I'd say 50, 60 bills, and they're presented by our attorney advocate standing behind me, I think, someplace, David Walrath, and also our chair, Susie Gibson, thank you. So anyway, so I think we're very comfortable. All the bills that CalSTRS, in most cases, take a position on, it may not be the same position, but we use those because we want to support the health of CalSTRS. Now, regarding divestments, a whole different ball of wax, because sitting and listening to the experts in investments, it's like, I no way am an expert and will never be an expert, but I get these long emails, as you probably do too, from members that say, why are we doing this? Let's get the CalSTRS cannot invest in this. And, you know, I take time to explain about the power of engagement, which was new to me. And then, but I have to end up our dialogue with, but we're protecting and securing our retirement. And so I step back from them and invite them to come to one of your board meetings and speak for themselves. So David may have more to add.
Hey, Dave.
Thank you, Dana. Dave Walrath, Legislative Advocate for CalRTA. In specific to the question, our general position is the same as what Paul said. It is your fund, it is our fund combined, you're the board, you have a constitutional fiduciary obligation. You have a process for making decisions about investments. We support honoring that process. So if the legislature wants to ask you to look at something, that's appropriate. That's a policy action of the legislature to ask. But for the legislature to say you must do X, we believe is a violation of that fiduciary, and that it is better, notwithstanding the escape clause may or may not work, who knows, but our general position has been that it should be a request, not a demand, and you use and honor the process you have developed for your fiduciary obligation. So, in last comment, we also have the general position of if the legislature wants to direct, then if we lose money, the general fund should indemnify 100%. Thank you.
So now I get to ask my questions. So in the write-up, we don't have who's pro and con. I know that CTA met last weekend. They took a position. They also had some concerns and were seeking amendments before they could go forward with any type of support. To David's point, it indemnifies board members, officers and employees, investment managers, but it doesn't indemnify the system, correct?
Correct.
And I'm really glad that we've had the robust discussion that we have, because I didn't, in the write-up, and this could just be on me, I didn't see where there was the fiduciary language that we always want to have in our bills. And I didn't get that it was permissive as instead of the nuance that you brought to it, Harvey. So I'm really glad that we've had this. We do have a motion to oppose. We've had board members that have spoken that they would rather see something else other than the oppose, but that's the motion that we have on our floor. The only way to do something different than that motion is for somebody to offer a substitute motion. If there's no substitutes, we'll vote on the motion as is. So I'll leave it to the board to decide what you want to do.